Welcome, everyone. I am here alongside my colleagues today to initiate the Library of Congress Cine Latine interview series, which is dedicated to sharing and documenting the work of emerging and established Latine filmmakers and is part of the Junior Fellow Cine Latine project. My name is Madeline Griffin, and I am a Junior Fellow at the Library of Congress and a Master's student at the University of New Mexico, where I study Latin American studies with a concentration in conflict, peace, and rights. I am honored to be working on the Cine Latine project this summer alongside Junior Fellows Carla Camacho and Mateo Arango and our fantastic project mentor, Dani Thurber. We are working together on this project to create what will be the first resource dedicated to Latine film in the library's history. Though off camera at the moment, Carla and Mateo will come in later to introduce themselves and ask a few questions. Today, we are here with the brilliant and emerging filmmaker, Alexis C. Garcia, who, aside from acting as a supervising producer of Buzzfeed's Paralike and a multitude of other projects, is a longtime creator and writer. Her credits include the Webby Award-winning series Quinceañera Come True, her first short film entitled Sam, and her new work, Daughter of the Sea, which is a short film released last year and is the result of her 2022 LALIFF Inclusion Fellowship. To date, Daughter of the Sea has received 19 awards and is still showing in film festivals worldwide. Integral to the artistry of Alexis's work is also the drive to create space for critical conversations that inform and uplift the Latine community across TV and digital mediums. Alexis, thank you so much for being here today. We have many questions to get into, so let's get started. To begin, I'll ask a bit about your story and your influences. So first question, when did you decide you wanted to pursue filmmaking as a career?
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be a part of this project. I know that it took a lot of work to put these interviews together, and I just want to say how necessary these conversations are and how appreciative I am that you are having them. And so on that note, so I first realized that I wanted to work in TV and film in my early adolescent years. I remember watching TV, and I mean, it would be the one thing that my family would all come around together for. It was like we would go to movies together and we'd watch TV shows together, and that was such a moving experience for us all to like experience emotions, to experience memories, to have this place that we would unite and just be able to have conversations around it. And I decided really young that I wanted to do that, whatever it was. I didn't know what I wanted to do exactly. I tried acting. I thought maybe that was it, and it definitely was not for me. And then in high school, I got into a program that was for high school students interested in working in TV and film, and I had the opportunity to work behind the scenes on different, job positions, like being a camera operator or directing a multi-camera, like live in studio thing. And I was like, this is what I want to be doing. I'm so much more, I'm a little bit more introverted than the person that's usually on camera. So then when I went to college, one of the priorities I had, well, first was to find a film program, but also I'm Puerto Rican, second generation. I was born in New York City. My parents were born in New York City. My grandparents on both sides of the family came to New York City in the 50s as part of the Great Migration to pursue a better life in the States. And so being Puerto Rican is a really essential lens through which I view and make sense of the world. It's, the grounding foundational culture from which I have, arrived. But that's being said, I was raised in the States and I didn't speak Spanish. I understood it. It was always on the tip of my tongue. And so when I went to college, it was really important to me that I learn Spanish. And so I became a Spanish major and moved to Chile and lived in Chile for a year. And during that time, I studied like the new Latin American cinema of the 60s and 70s. And that kind of, blew open my world view with regards to the kind of stories that we could be telling on screen, because I think with regards to being raised in the States, a lot of the images that were served as just, consuming mass media is a very Americanized perspective. And that was one of the goals of this new Latin American cinema of the 60s and 70s was to battle against the American dominance of cinema and mass media. And so they were also doing something like really cool, which was representing the diversity of folkloric traditions in Latin American culture. And that was something very kind of new for me and exciting because I was like, oh, I could have a voice and I could do something a little bit different. And I could celebrate my culture and I could lean into this thing. And so going through like living in Chile and becoming fluent in Spanish, I came back to the States, and my world view was a lot more expanded. And so when I was graduating, I had only been able to attain like learning screenwriting, which was fine because that was all I needed to kind of get an entryway into the industry. And I moved to New York City after I graduated. And I was working in like as an intern at a nonprofit women's film organization, and they were getting all of these grant opportunities through their doors. And I saw one that was specifically for writers in LA. It was run by the National Hispanic Media Coalition. And I applied and I got in. It was for, it's a TV writing fellowship. And that, brought me out to LA to actually be a participant in the industry. And I think I've over answered this question, so I'm going to stop myself here.
No, thank you. Actually, you started on my next question, which is, are there like any specific filmmakers who have influenced your work, or that you grew up watching or learning about, that you think have influenced your own trajectory?
Yeah, I think well, so I really loved, this is so interesting. It's like so basic, but also Martin Scorsese and what he did for Italian culture, right, is introduce a lot of like the Italian American experience in a way that was cinematic and compelling. And so I feel really like heavily influenced by him in just the way that he was able to navigate cultural stories in a cinematic way. And then also I think that when I say like Spielberg is also another really big influence, because he his stories create a sense of like hope and nostalgia and a longing for things to be a little bit more magical. And I'm deeply influenced by literary genre of magical realism, which is another, has origins in Latin America, and just how it's this genre that's grounded in reality, but where miraculous and magical things can happen at any moment. And so I think that's where I've kind of found myself and my voice is combining some of these aesthetics of the filmmakers I admired with the influences of what it is to be Latin American. And that also I'm very much deeply influenced by like this Afrofuturism and the work of, I saw this film last year, Neptune Frost by one of the directors is Saul Williams, and I'm a longtime fan of his, but the aesthetic that they were able to create by imagining, this, it's like a cultural aesthetic that envisions liberated Black identity and Black, Black life and Black futures, and a reclaiming of our heroism, and that all of these things have combined to create the the voice that I think, or the lane that I found myself in.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. And then my final question In much of your work, and especially in your more recent film, Daughter of the Sea, this story is fundamentally a Latina story. So for those who are unfamiliar with your newest film, could you first tell us a little bit more about your short film? And then I'd love to hear about how your lived experiences have informed or inspired your story practice in general, or this film specifically.
Thank you. So Daughter of the Sea is about a young woman who experiences a spiritual awakening. After the death of her grandfather, she's called by Yemaya, who is the Orisha goddess of the sea, the African Orisha goddess from Yoruba spiritual tradition. And this story is very close to my own life experience. My grandmother on my mother's side is a spirit medium, and she had a Botánica in the Bronx for many years. And I remember going to the Botánica and there being these Catholic saints and statues right next to images of Yemaya and Oshun, Obatala, all the Orishas. And that was like very normal to me. It didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary until I grew up and I realized, oh wow, it's unusual for these Orishas to coexist with this Christianity, and I realized it was part of a larger cultural tradition. And I was in the process of my own spiritual awakening. I think we all kind of go through that in our when we're transitioning into adulthood, is this unpacking of our identity, and not just our cultural identity, but who we are on a spiritual level and who we are on a fundamental level, the essence of who we are. And so this film came to me, I think, channeled through the spirits, because I think that we've also been in this process of decolonizing our worldview, decolonizing the way that we have understood and made sense of history and seen the influence of white supremacy in our lives. And one of the things that has survived for so many generations is this spiritual practice of observing the Orishas and praising them and having them as having religions based around them. And the fact that these religions have survived in the face of so much oppression and colonization is a miracle. And so I feel like I was called to tell this story, and that I was the only one that could have told this story because of the way that I was raised, because of the fact that I actually have like a filmmaking background. And so it's very unique to me, but it speaks to so many people. So many of the responses that I've gotten from this film is, wow, I feel so seen. I've never seen myself portrayed like that. And that was definitely one of the goals of the film, was to help people feel seen, and for the first time to portray a image and an imagination of Yemaya on screen that was true to her origin of coming from Africa, of coming from West Africa, because a lot of the images of Yemaya, if you Google her, are she's been her skin has been lightened, her hair has been straightened, and she's been westernized to fit the aesthetic of Western beauty standards, or European beauty standards, excuse me. And so, yeah, this film is an ode to our ancestors and their magic, and the source from which we've all come. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And unfortunately, though I would love to ask a million questions, I'm going to pass it over to Carla, who will ask you a bit more about your conceptual processes as an artist.
Amazing. Thank you, Madeline.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Carla, and I'm so thrilled that you're here with us today. Thank you. A little bit about me. I'm a junior fellow also here at the Library of Congress, working on the Latino Latina project. I'm from Brownsville, Texas, and I'm a recent graduate from Yale University, where I studied ethnic studies and education studies, with a particular focus and interest on the history of the US-Mexico borderlands and the history of education. So like Madeline said, my questions are going to be sort of about the themes in your work and your directing process. My first question is, what themes do you like to explore in your work and why? And what ideas or critical conversations do you want your public to take away from your work?
First of all, congrats, Carla, on graduating. It's an amazing accomplishment. Your future is very bright. And thank you for your thoughtful question. The themes that I like to explore in my work are about home and finding a place of home, not just geographically in the world, but also a home within oneself. I think that as a child of the diaspora and having always lived in the US, but known I was Puerto Rican and had a connection to the island, I think a lot of my own kind of unpacking of my identity is about finding home and finding a place in the world. And so I think a lot of the themes that I'm really interested in exploring surround that, as well as family and love and healing. I consider myself, I've already shared that my grandmother is a spirit medium, and part of her practice is using her gifts to heal people on a spiritual level, physical ailments too. People come to her with, sore knees and stuff like that, and she's able to give them some kind of prescription. And I recognize that part of the legacy from which I've descended is this healing legacy, and that my modality for healing is through storytelling and through filmmaking, and I aspire to be able to use the medium of television and film to help people find a place of home within themselves, but also hopefully find some tools for healing emotional wounds specifically, or making sense of a world in ways that that only they can get from experiencing a story. I don't know if I answered the second question, if you wouldn't mind repeating it.
I think you covered it with the last part, but yeah, it was, if you want to expand on it, what ideas or critical conversations do you want your public to take away from watching your work?
Yeah, I did touch on it, but I am like a very firm believer too. Like when I go on Instagram, I see so many different things about people being engaged in different kinds of healing practices, whether it's like herbalism or therapy, or I think there's a lot of opportunities and tools for us to be able to enact healing, and I see. I was listening to this podcast with one of my favorite authors. His name is Young Pueblo, and he posts his poems on Instagram, and he was talking about how the current generation of humans are here to heal our past, and to in order to liberate ourselves to live more freely, and to show up in spaces and be our authentic selves. And so that really resonated with me, because I was like, that is the heart and soul of all of the work that I've done, is just trying to create community in my storytelling and connection, and help people feel seen. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much. On that note of sort of the themes that you explore in your work, have there been any challenging moments in which you've had to balance the sort of entertainment value that is maybe meant to come with producing a film, and balancing that with the themes that you want to center? And if so, how do you approach that balance?
Yeah, I think, it's funny, because like you could have a great idea for a story, and it might not be entertaining at all. Or, you have to be really mindful of the audience. And I think in my time working in digital, one of the feedback loops that you have with creating content for the internet is interaction, comments. People are liking something if it resonates with them, or commenting if they like it, also commenting if they don't like it, but being really open and honest about the content they're consuming. And so during my time in digital, I was able to really engage with understanding specifically what resonates with the Latina audience. And so that helped inform me in making my film without compromising the voice and the art that I wanted to create. I think the harder part of it is actually the commerce aspect of it, and finding financing, and how do you make a living off of this thing that is kind of like because I'm like so deeply engaged with this storytelling. It's like a part of my, I feel like, mission driven in this work that I've chosen to do. It's impossible for me to turn it off, but the fact that I have to monetize it becomes a balancing act that is kind of challenging, because many of us have experienced economic barriers in being able to pursue filmmaking and being able to pursue any opportunities in the industry, because we don't have a legacy of family members to rely on who have experience in the industry, and B, oftentimes we don't come from economic situations in which we could have our first 5 years in the industry bankrolled by a family member, which many people have had that advantage. And that's something that we as a community battle against, and why I think community is so important, because we have to lift each other up, and we have to support each other in these endeavors if we want to get our stories told.
Thank you. And my final question for you is, so filmmaking is a pretty challenging job, both physically and emotionally, I can imagine. So you've been a storyteller, but through your films, you also have engaged in sort of advocacy work. Why do you direct, and what keeps you motivated to continue creating the stories that you do?
Yeah, I just mentioned that I very much feel that my life is a mission, and my mission is to create, to be a storyteller. And it's very difficult. It's taken a lot of years to be able to pursue this path. I've done a lot of other jobs on the way to being able to do this job. And for many years, when I was working at Like, I was the strategist behind the brand. I was doing content strategy. So I wasn't even directing, and I wasn't even producing videos. I was the person behind. I was like the voice of the brand. I was literally like writing the story of the brand and helping the producers to create the content that would tell the story of the brand. And that felt like I was really happy to be there, but I was like, oh, I'm not totally aligned with my path. And that bumping up against that frustration was kind of like what got me to do the next thing, right? Which was, do the Quinceañera show. And I also feel like we don't really have the opportunity to be frivolous with the kind of stories that we want to tell. Like we have so many issues happening in the world, and not that we shouldn't have frivolous stories, because escapism is so important. Like I love a rom-com. That's, hook me up with a good rom-com any day. But I do feel like if I am going to be engaged in something that is like I'm turning over part of my life for it, I want it to have a positive impact. And I would hope that this impact is seen, but also helps to create a legacy, or even like contribute to the canon of stories that are untold, and to put my focus on the communities that have not had a voice and not had a platform previously. And so I feel very, I think like one of my meditation practice reminds me to like be present every day and not kind of think too far into the future. And that's been really helpful because there's a lot of anxiety that comes when you're like, oh man, I did this thing last year. I did Daughter of the Sea, and I'm in progress on writing a feature now because my goal has always been to tell longer form stories, like ever since when I was, graduating from college. That my goal was to make a feature-length film, and it's taken a really long time to get here, and it's been really circuitous, and there wasn't a straight line to be able to get to this point. But that being said, it's like I'm driven to get to that next point and to continue to do this as a storyteller and filmmaker. Sorry, that I think this question was, you felt the pain. The pain in the process of answering the question is like literally the pain that I've experienced is trying to be a director, and but also I think I was able to share what keeps me motivated.
No, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. It's been great to get a glimpse into the way you think about your directing and all the media projects you've been involved in. Now I'm gonna pass it on to Mateo.
Thank you, Carla.
Hello, Alexis. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mateo Arango. I'm a junior fellow, also working on the Cine Latina project. I'm a PhD student in American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. And my research looks at material culture and cultural production as a way of understanding marginalized histories in Latin America. And I have a few questions to wrap up our wonderful conversation. We definitely learned a lot so far. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about the theme of representation. So for my first question, I'd like us to go back to your film, Daughter of the Sea. And in the film, you highlight a powerful representation of Afro-Latinidad and indigenous culture in Puerto Rico. And I was wondering what African and indigenous influences or histories are highlighted in the film, and how are they central to not only where you filmed, but also who the lead characters are?
Thank you, Mateo. A great question. So I tapped into this a little bit, but the spiritual tradition that is highlighted in this film is the Yoruba spiritual tradition from West Africa, which was brought over by our African ancestors during the transatlantic slave trade. It was brought to the West, to the Caribbean and Latin America, some parts of the US. And this tradition, the spiritual tradition, it is the umbrella for Santeria, it's for Ifa, for Lukumi, which are religions that are held within the banner of the Yoruba spiritual tradition. And in Puerto Rico specifically, where we filmed, and the film is about Puerto Ricans. We also tap into the Taino indigenous Taino indigenous roots. The opening scene, there is a spirit of death that comes and takes the grandfather into the mountains, or Balmonte. And our Taino ancestors believed that when someone would pass, their spirit would go into the mountains, and they would seek refuge in the mountains from when the colonizers arrived. They would run to the mountains, and the mountains were known as a place of safety. And so it was really important to me, because I think as a Puerto Rican, I've grown up with these three identities, knowing that I was a descendant of the Spaniards, a descendant of the Africans, and a descendant of the Taino. And then as soon as I did my 23andMe, sure enough, that's exactly the mix that came back, with some other surprising percentages, like from Asia, but that just affirmed the fact that it's amazing that Puerto Ricans, we know this about ourselves, and how there are things that exist within our everyday life that are still an ode to these ancestors and their influence in our lives. And so when I was creating this film, I was like very deeply engaged in making sure that everything was authentic, from the ritual that was portrayed on screen. My cousin Selena, who we share the same spirit medium grandmother, she became a folklorist, and she studied at the knee of my grandmother for many years and went to Cuba and studied Lukumi for many years. And she was basically my consultant in being able to make sure that the things that we were portraying were as accurate as possible, and how they built the watermelon offering for Yemaya. And then also just kind of going into the details of the costume. And we hired all Puerto Rican cast and crew to be a part of this, and every one of these creatives brought their best work, which I think is, as a director, that's kind of what you're tasked with, is making sure that everyone that is part of the crew is able to be the best collaborator and best version of an artist that they want to be. And we were very fortunate in that those things came together for us. But there was a lot of spirit magic that happened to get this film off the ground, and then happened throughout the process of making the film. And this is the stuff that's kind of unexplainable. And for someone who's a non-believer might not believe it, but my lived experience of creating this film was so humbling, because I could not believe how strong the I knew that Yemaya was moving through this project, and she was the one that was making our way. And so that was really cool to experience this. And I was like, wow, from now on, I really want to make films in Puerto Rico all the time. And I want to be able to continue to highlight our culture in this way, and from a lens that is usually not seen, because it has been diminished and also looked down upon for so many years. Anything that isn't Christian essentially has kind of a negative connotation, because it runs contrary to the overarching belief of Christianity, which is Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And so this film kind of presents Yemaya to the mainstream, and it announces that she's still around, and that she's still available to us. I've said this after a lot of Q&As when I go to festivals, and that it's, as children of the diaspora, we don't have much in the way of a material inheritance other than how we present in the world, but we do have access to a spiritual inheritance. And that's what this film is about. It's about introducing a new generation, or even an elder generation, to Yemaya, and to a living inheritance that exists for us, even our indigenous ancestors' spiritual inheritance that is available to all of us. It's just about being able to access it and finding points of access. And I hope that this film provides a point of access to this diosa.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing, these very important cultural perspectives and the nuances, like not just a very monolithic approach to telling these stories, but really showing the diversity of culture that exists on the island and in Latin America. So for my next question, in past interviews, you mentioned, and also earlier, you talked about your influence of Afrofuturism in your work. So I was wondering, why is this central to your film, Daughter of the Sea? And how do you see this artistic movement influencing the future of Latina cinema?
Great question. I think it's a really exciting time to be like claiming our Blackness. And I think Afrofuturism, just the vision of Afrofuturism is one of liberation and reclaiming of our heroism, right? And so I think that this, the idea of it was really exciting to me, because in Puerto Rican culture, like when I was being raised, your proximity to whiteness determined your value, and how you saw yourself in the world, and how you saw your own value in the world. And for Black Puerto Ricans, being white is not happening, not in this lifetime. You are put on this planet, and this is how you look, and this is, and that's great. That's a great thing. But our culture has not celebrated our Blackness. And so it was so important to me to create an example of celebration, and be able to show the dignity of our African ancestors and their legacy in the world. And so it really excites me too, because I know that there's so many more stories to be told, and there's so much more work that we can do in this atmosphere, and that's all with the goal and the aspiration of the next generation being able to be proud of who they are, proud of their, big curly hair, or their dark skin, and just really embrace the fact that we have this amazing African heritage, and hopefully for people to be excited about engaging in that legacy.
Thank you so much. And that ties into my final question, which is, what tips would you give aspiring Latina filmmakers who may be interested in sharing similar cultural stories and histories moving forward?
Yes, I'm excited. Thank you for this question. It makes me really excited to think of future generation of storytellers, and the amazing stories that they are going to tell. I think that the biggest piece of advice that I can give an aspiring filmmaker is to find community, and to also apply to these programs. A lot of us don't have access to the industry, or to learning about the industry, except through these programs that exist, like the National Hispanic Media Coalition, or LALIFF, which is the National Association of Latino Independent Producers. And LALIFF is a really amazing community. The LA Latino National Film Festival has an institute called LFI, which is Latino Film Institute. And so it's like painful, I know, to network sometimes, but just having showing up and being there sometimes is all that you need in order to get the inspiration and the motivation to keep going. And so, yeah, I think those are my two biggest pieces of advice, and I hope that's helpful to somebody.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I will now pass it over to Madeline to conclude our conversation for today.
Thank you, Mateo.
Okay, Alexis, thank you so much for joining Carla, Mateo, and I to chat about your work and the impacts you are making on the industry. I think today we've learned not only about your recent film, but we also gained some insight into your process and evolution as a creator and storyteller. Thank you for spending this time with us today, and we're so excited to see where your work goes in the future.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, everyone.